Now, I'm so excited to welcome to the virtual stage our guest speaker, Rajesh Anandan, for a fireside chat with Erin Kelly. Rajesh is the co-founder and CEO of Ultranauts, Inc., a quality engineering firm powered by cognitively diverse teams. And Erin Kelly is an MIT Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organization Studies, co-director in the Institute for Work and Employment Research, and faculty director of the Good Companies, Good Jobs initiative. I'll pass it on to the two of you.
Terrific. Thank you, Alona. It's really a pleasure to be here as part of this Hack for Inclusion effort. And really, I'm delighted to have had a chance to connect with Rajesh briefly this week and to have this conversation. So let's start with, please tell us briefly about the mission of Ultranauts.
Sure. Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Alona, for having us. And good morning to everyone. I have an 8-year-old who is not pleased that I'm not living up to my priority number one as a human. But that said, if I were to be doing something other than playing this morning, I'm happy to be talking with you guys. So Ultranauts, my co-founder Art Scheckman and I founded the company about 8 years ago with a mission to demonstrate that neurodiversity, including autism, could be a competitive advantage for business. And our theory of change is very simple, which is to build a world-class, commercially viable, successful business that could compete and win and deliver better value for our clients in our domain, which is software and data quality engineering services. And along the way, just reimagine how a company operates, how an organization finds talent, how you train team members, how you manage teams, how you communicate with each other, how you nurture and develop careers, all so that everyone has a fair shot at success. And then take everything we're learning and share it openly, which is why I'm happy to be here to share what we've learned over the last 8 years.
Terrific. Thank you. I mean, one of the things that I think is so fascinating is this core premise that we need to change the way we work in order for everyone to thrive, and that's the way to fully utilize and connect with diverse talent, including people with neurodiverse capabilities or backgrounds, of course. And in my own research, I have heard a lot about framing flexibility, workplace flexibility, as an accommodation, right? And one of the things that I like to point out is that implicitly implies, it's early on Saturday, right? That implies that the company or the manager will try to make an adjustment for particular people with recognized disabilities, people who are asking for something different for work, family reasons, or others who are seeking accommodations. And implicitly, we're assuming the normal practices are working well and are benefiting the firm. But you're arguing that's not necessarily the case. So can you share how your universal approach has shaped how you approach flexibility?
Yeah. Well, first, it's important to acknowledge that the current state is broken. Mm-hmm. You know, you've all seen the stats around the unbelievably high numbers of employees who are not engaged or actively disengaged. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine running an organization where most of your team members are not engaged? How do you produce value? You know, before COVID, as one of the former surgeon generals in the US called loneliness an epidemic, you know, 40% of American workers were feeling socially isolated. And that has real impact not only on the individual's well-being, but on team performance. You know, so first, it's not just that the workplace and the norms are broken through the lens of inclusion or diversity or equity, belonging. It's broken, period.
Right.
So that's the starting point, which is, well, surely we can do better. our thesis is that point solutions don't work. We're a bunch of engineers. There's plenty of examples from the worlds of manufacturing and engineering. If you try to solve, a problem through a very narrow lens without understanding the system or getting down to the root cause, you will create additional problems, possibly worse than the ones you started with. And so the journey we're on is to try to reimagine that workplace and redesign every aspect of how a company operates, and create what we call a universal workplace, which is simply applying universal design principles to the system that is work. And so at the core of it, and one of the foundational building blocks, is flexibility being the norm. So we have been fully remote from day one. So when the COVID crisis started to unfold, operationally nothing changed, and because we'd already been working from home. So today we have teammates in 29 states across the US. 3/4 of our team are autistic, and we're diverse along many other dimensions. 40% of our team are cisgender female, 38% of our team are cisgender male, 5% of our team are non-binary, 5% of our team are trans. We're diverse socioeconomically. Almost 40% of our team had an income below the poverty line before they joined the company. 3/4 of the team were not employed or underemployed before they joined the firm. And yet, while having this incredibly diverse team, we've been able to show over and over again that we can outperform our industry. We grew by 70% last year in the midst of COVID. And that's because not just that we have diversity on the team, but because we are attempting, and we're not doing this well every day, but we're attempting to create the context and the systems and the tools and practices within which that diverse team can truly shine. Because if you can actually tap into everyone's unique strengths, if you can not leave anything on the table in terms of human potential, when the competition is 40% of employees are not engaged, you're going to do better, right? And so flexibility is important. So work from home and being virtual is one dimension, is choose where you work. And for us, there is no choice to be in the office. So in a way, maybe that doesn't work for some people, which I understand. And Professor Bloom at Stanford did some early work with the first sort of real study looking with a control group looking at this at scale. And the ideal answer is give people the choice of where they work. Have an office they can come into. In our case, we are fully virtual. We also think about flexibility along other dimensions. How much you work, the unit of work, the work week. We've moved away from this idea of an FTE, the sort of mythical full-time equivalent employee that all consultants, now is the next Bainey, we all use as units of measure in most organizations. And the reality is we have not been able to find any empirical evidence that a 40-hour work week or a 50-hour work week is optimally productive for humans. Not all humans, not most humans. So why are we doing this? And in our case, we have teammates who are incredibly capable and have a lot to contribute, but where a full-time job, so to speak, would be counterproductive. And so most salaried roles in our company, you have the choice to be sort of quote full-time or 3/4 time or half-time. That's your choice. And then your salary is prorated, and really there's no kind of cost to the company per se, other than we just have to organize our work that allows these different units of work weeks to function. And so far it's going fine. And I'd say another dimension of flexibility is in how you interact and how you communicate. A significant number of our teammates have selective mutism and don't speak. Significant number of our teammates struggle with auditory processing. So, it's just unnecessarily taxing on your brain if you're trying to follow this kind of conversation versus much more efficient to absorb it through text, for example. And we're trying to free up as much of our team's brain capacity to do the work that adds value to clients, not worrying about all this other stuff, which adds no value. And so we're multimodal. Whenever we have meetings, we've got a chat window open, and I would say the majority of the team are interacting that way versus speaking up. Speaking up might also limit teammates from contributing who might be more reserved or who might find that experience to be anxiety producing. And so all this to say, the answer isn't, well, I'm going to create the accommodation A for group B, because that kind of thinking can lead to, in our field, we call regression errors, which is something else is going to pop up, versus taking the time to get to the root cause of why is this not working for this team member, and going after that root cause aggressively. Look, on our team, we are fully distributed and we're incredibly diverse, and we're running agile teams that are delivering solutions and scalable test automation frameworks, or we're doing enterprise data quality audits and super technical work, and nobody's giving us sort of an easy ride here, because we have a mission. We've got to deliver value, and we need to do it with teams that have a wide range of thinking styles and information processing models, which, by the way, is a source of our advantage, but also communication preferences and stress triggers. We're running teams where we might have teammates with generalized anxiety disorder or workplace PTSD, and any number of events could be triggering. And so we can't ignore some of the, let's say, inconveniences in most workplaces that get swept under the rug, because in our case, it could cause a really bad event. And this stuff does happen, and we're always learning, but we've got to root it out.
I love this. I love that it starts from just a fundamental place of respect for people and what they want to contribute to their team, and then says, how do we collectively figure out the way that you can make that contribution and feel connected and supported and like you can thrive and do your best work. It's a really, I think, important shift from, as you said, the assumption that the status quo is functional or optimal or, anything other than broken. And you've laid that out so well. I see, speaking of multimodal, I see some interesting ideas in the chat here. And I will say, as someone who's learned to teach virtually in the last year, I think it is inclusive to have multiple ways of contributing to a conversation. We see different folks weighing in on the chat in the classroom, in the Zoom classroom, than we would see in our MBA classroom, where some people are quick to raise their hand and speak in a group of 70, and other people are very reluctant to do that. So I want to pull on Casey's question. How were you able to create a safe space where employees first wanted to share their identities, and then building that out a little bit more? What are the tools or strategies that employees and managers need to develop to create that truly inclusive team?
Sure. And I think the notion of psychological safety, I'm assuming, is familiar to this audience, and that is at the core of creating any kind of functional group. Because if you don't feel safe to be yourself, obviously respectfully, because being a jerk is not an excuse,
right.
But if you don't have that, then it's really hard to build anything meaningful. And it's a constant journey. I would say there's plenty of, there's a lot of literature on psychological safety and sort of techniques and tactics you can use. But I'd say a couple things where, when you're building an organization, talk is cheap. And so when there is a opportunity to be vulnerable as a manager or a leader, or really as a peer, if you feel safe, that signals to the reptilian brains of all the other humans around you that, oh, this must be safe because this person is being vulnerable, and then nothing happened, nothing bad happened, or when someone calls out something that's wrong, or when you fail or make a mistake as a manager or leader, that's a golden moment to show that, to acknowledge it, embrace it, and show that something positive is going to come out of it. I mean, we had we have a monthly update at the company, and it's a virtual town hall, and a couple colleagues, including on the leadership team, shared some very, personal challenges they're struggling with, and that took so much courage to do. And it only happens if you've already created the space where that can happen. And then another colleague called out, and in a situation that seemed really tough, and took the management team to task. And so everybody's now watching, like, what happens next, right?
How did the leaders respond? Right. Yeah.
What was it taken seriously? Was it safe to do that? Will there be action? And so I think those moments create a real opportunity and put the talk to the test, right? Will we live up to the thing we're trying to do? I would say, just in general, to create that kind of safety, people have to feel valued. And to do that, you need to be able to contribute in the way that works for you, not be forced to fit into some theoretical median of how you contribute. You need to feel connected, and that means you have relationships and strong bonds. It's the same in your personal life, right? You can't feel safe if you're isolated.
Right.
And you need to see that being vulnerable or making mistakes or failing is not penalized. And that has to be seen. It has to be experienced. There's no way you're going to believe it just because someone tells you that.
And I hear that your whole approach sends a signal by saying, we're not expecting everyone to fit into this box. We've set up everything we do so that we're flexible, responsive, recognizing the power of diversity comes from when people are able to connect in the way that makes sense to them. And then it seems like that may start that process. Do you want to talk about this idea of a user's guide for teammates, or a biodex? I'm not sure whether you're still using it, but it's
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a few years ago, one of our team members sort of posed a simple question, or a simple wish, something along the lines of, like, I could never really figure out how to work with some of the teammates on my project. I just wish humans came with a user manual. And, of course, all the engineers thought, oh my gosh, yes, humans should totally come with a user manual. And that simple notion evolved into what we call a biodex. You could think of it as a quick start guide for how to work with me. If you're going to work with me, here are some things you should know. It's fairly structured. There's 20 fields. A bunch of it is around things you should really know about your teammates if you're working remotely. So, for example, what's your average response time on whatever, in our case, on Slack? Because if I Slack you and I'm waiting and I don't know how long I'm waiting, well, that's going to disrupt my flow. That kills productivity. Or in some cases, it might create a ton of anxiety. That's not good for well-being or productivity. And so now I just look up your biodex. Or if I ping you and you don't respond, what do I do next? If it's urgent, do I text you? Do I ping you again? Because I don't, if I'm not aware of how you'd prefer, I could trigger you. I could create stress. I could create anxiety, because when we're remote, we're not seeing each other. You can't see how someone's doing. Not that seeing someone means you actually know how they're doing, but it's a little bit safer than you have no idea. And then some of it gets to the core of what I think are some basic misperceptions perceptions that keep being propagated, including through well-meaning, management training programs, right? So a bunch of fields in the biodex are around how you prefer to receive feedback, including critical feedback. And the truth is, there's no silver bullet. If there was, on like, here's how you give good critical feedback, somebody would have built a great tool around it. And in our case, the biodex has several fields around your preferences for receiving critical feedback, like timing. Do you want it in the moment or at the end of the day or in the week? Delivery, do you want it in a live conversation or in writing, so you can digest it on your own terms and then have a conversation if you have questions? Or framing, is there a phrase that could be used or some other way to frame this feedback simply to make it easier for you to hear, because that's the whole point, versus taking, coaching everyone on how you give good feedback is all, if you have critical feedback, always give it in the moment, in a live conversation, sandwiched by positive affirming comments. And really, that may not work for most people, and certainly doesn't on our team.
Sure, very interesting. One of the things that I hear in that description is making it safe and expected to lay out our own preferences, and then asking managers and coworkers to treat people as individuals and to recognize that that's the path to really high productivity and high commitment and high belonging and like feeling good about being a part of this organization. I see a question here. The name is not provided, but about how you met your coworkers and co-founders. How did you find each other? And do you have suggestions here? I'm extending the question a little bit. Do you have suggestions about finding others who share a mission, share a vision, as well as, are interested in the same solution for the market?
Yeah, well, in my case, with Ultranauts, my co-founder was my old roommate. We were at MIT together, and we'd never worked with each other, but we lived together, and not just in the same house, in the same room. We were roommates, and so we've have a long history. And I think in other venture I'd started without not with my roommate. It was still with people I'd had the chance to do at least a bit of work with, because the thing is, starting a company is not quite like having a child, but it is similar in that in the early days, the thing you are bringing to life is very fragile, and the tiniest sort of threat could be life-threatening. And you want to make sure that your partner in that process is someone that you trust, but also under duress will have your back and you will have theirs. Because there'll be times where you will hopefully fundamentally disagree, because if you both think the same, then you've got the wrong co-founder. There's no value add there, right? But you want to have enough, similar to being a co-parent, like you want to have had enough trust built up in your reserves that you could disagree, you could get upset with each other, but never question each other's intent, and always be able to go back to the basics and the trust that you have, because it is incredibly stressful and unnerving and uncertain and an emotional roller coaster ride until you get it to a point where it's a viable business. And it took us a bunch of years to get there, and at this point, it's great. We're growing at 70%, and we're, and we still have a lot of interesting problems to solve. But I think it is, to me at least, if you can, it's really important to find a way to actually work with someone, do something before you dive in and start a company together,
Sure.
so that you have built up some trust and some understanding of the real strengths you bring, because you can't really get that from being in a class together because we're all, putting on a show, or seeing what someone's work experience was on paper, because that's not particularly meaningful.
I think that's a terrific piece of advice. And part of the appeal of these kind of short-term projects like hackathons is learning how to connect, and seeing how others approach problems. Of course, probably one weekend together isn't going to build the kind of deep trust that you're talking about, but doing that allows you to practice building those kinds of relationships. Venati asks a question that is similar to one I had. What do you see as the biggest challenge for firms or organizations that were previously either office-based or maybe a few people could work flexibly, but now post-pandemic will be fully hybrid? And I get asked this question sometimes based on my past research. What do we need to do after this disruption to build it back better?
So I think the tendency is to focus on the logistics and the infrastructure, and those are important things. And in March, when a lot of companies were going remote, some of our clients reached out just to ask, we're not HR consultants, but they're like, hey, you guys have been doing this, like, what do we do? And we work with mostly Fortune 5, like AIG or Bloomberg, Bank of New York Mellon, Comcast, and so on. We work with startups as well, like Slack. What's really important is that once you get over the hurdle of kind of figuring out the logistics, there's a few things to keep in mind. One is that being remote can create a lot of insecurity and uncertainty and anxiety, because as humans, we are deprived of a lot of the sort of belonging cues that you might get when you're physically in the same space as another human. And there's no way to counter that sort of evolutionary need. But you can come close. So you just have to acknowledge that your team is going to be feeling less secure and more isolated. And so you have to be very intentional about addressing those, because, nobody is productive when they're insecure and lonely.
Right.
The second is that the tendency is to conflate flexibility with a lack of boundaries. And yes, it's great that you have the flexibility now to actually go deal with remote learning crisis of the day. That if you have kids at home,
all needs you because they got kicked off of Zoom, right?
Yeah, but that's not actually a perk if then you're expected to be responding on Slack or Teams or whatever it is in real time at all times of the day. And being very clear about what those expectations are is really important. And I would say the third thing is that you can get close to replicating some of the sort of fortuitous collisions that happen in the workplace, but socially and professionally, so that the real work and the real relationships can still happen. A couple of things we do at Ultranauts. One is many of our projects might have a kind of always on virtual workroom where the Scrum Master or the project manager might keep an eye on it, and people just come in there when they have a problem, or they had a light bulb go off, and then a bunch of people on the team will swarm around it, because it's those moments that you have to capture. Problem solving doesn't happen because somebody scheduled a meeting at 3 p.m. today. Like that's not how work happens. Similarly, socially, we have a cafeteria channel in Slack, which is essentially what you might imagine it to be. It's for impromptu, non-work related chats or hangouts. And you can just go in there and see if anyone else wants to hang out. And a couple folks have a standing cafeteria chat on Thursdays. And but you can create spaces for collisions to happen in a positive way, that can start to mimic what happens in the hallway kind of thing. And around boundaries, we try to be very clear about what's expected, what are business hours, what is okay in terms of stepping away from your desk, so to speak, to go do something that you need to go do. When do you need to tell people that you did that? Right. And I think these are simple rules, but spelling it out will not only help align the team, because ultimately we just need to know what to expect. What can I expect from you? Because I can't see you. You're not at your desk. I don't know what you're doing. And I just need to know what to expect.
Yeah, I love all of this. Pre-pandemic, I had run a major field experiment in a Fortune 500 company. You mentioned Nick Bloom's work in call centers, but this was actually with white-collar professionals and many IT professionals. And it facilitated work from home, but the central part of it were these team conversations about how do we want to work together, and how do we work together so that there's not an assumption that the person who's responding to the chat quickest is the most productive, and anybody who needs to turn off chat for an hour to do their actual work is quote unquote slacking, right? I mean, there's some irony about the use of Slack as a app now versus kind of the expectation that we're virtually available to each other at all times. And for some people that's valued. I hear you say the cafeteria space, or knowing that you can get some colleagues pitching in when you're facing a challenge, that's really valuable. But it shouldn't be how we evaluate someone's performance, how responsive they are, how easily you can reach them at any moment. So I love how you've created these venues, these opportunities for teams to talk about things that they should have been talking about all along in all kinds of workplaces, but you've created that structure. I wanted to switch question to a couple questions about Ultranauts partnerships with other groups. So there was a question about, do Ultranauts employees mentor children and youth on the autism spectrum? There was a question about, how does Ultranauts decide maybe colleges and universities that you might want to partner with and focus your recruiting on? Can you talk a little bit about some of the valuable relationships beyond the company?
Sure. So we currently don't have a sort of mentoring program or an internship program, and that's partly a function of being a startup. Those programs require some thought and attention to set up in a way to create a meaningful experience. And we're still small, and so we're hoping we'll get to it at some point, but it doesn't happen yet. We are taking a first step to in that direction, in taking a lot of the internal training that we've developed for inexperienced sort of new hires who are new to the field of quality engineering, and exposing it outside the company through a kind of Ultranauts virtual academy. Great. That would allow anyone really who wants to know more about the field or learn some of the foundational skills to be able to go through a learning experience that has been designed for neurodiversity, for diverse learners, and is self-paced, is information dense, is sort of multimodal, is all of the things that we've done for ourselves. So that's sort of the first step, which is, because we exist in part to create a pathway to opportunity to capable humans who just haven't had a fair shot before. We're trying to, take some of the stuff we're doing for ourselves and expose it outside the company.
Great.
And then, I would say, just in terms of universities and so on, we do have relationships with, I would say, most or all university programs that have, or universities that have technical degrees, and also programs for students who are neurodivergent. My colleague Marcel Champy, who's been heading outreach and is an advocate and activist, and holds everyone, including the organization, to task when we screw up, has built out a massive network outside of just universities, because and we work with job placement groups as well, but not everyone will have had the chance to complete, start or complete a university degree, or not everyone or most people may not feel comfortable or able to seek out services from, let's say, employment services providers. And so, we think of it no different than you would if you were looking for a persona of a customer. You'd figure out how to meet them where they are. And so, thanks to Marcel's work, we've built out a massive network of a virtual network of blogs and websites and social media groups where neurodivergent adults are likely to be, and that's where we post our jobs, because we just assume, again, going back to the where we started, if we assume that the ideal team member is not going to be on LinkedIn or isn't in this field already, then we're just going to behave differently in terms of how we source talent. Now, that said, everything that happens after you apply, so when it comes to sourcing, we try really hard to cast a wider net to reach the communities and the pools of talent that we think could be great, but just haven't been inside this world of work before. That's not to say we don't hire experienced engineers or data science. We do, but we also try really hard to get outside of the kind of world of people who have previous work experience or who have academic credentials. But what happens after that is the same for everyone, and everyone, and I know there was a question around recruiting and hiring. The kind of unfortunate reality is that the most common techniques used for recruiting or screening, once you've sourced applicants, what happens next are you look at a resume, and then you have a most likely unstructured job interview. And those two tools are terrible at predicting job performance. I mean, there's a bunch of studies around this, but the correlation between years of work experience and on-the-job performance is, an R squared of 0.03. It's useless. And an unstructured interview is a little bit better, but not that much more. But so we try to use job tests and work simulations. But the really important part is we don't just do it for entry-level roles. We do it for all roles. We don't just do it for neurodivergent applicants. We do it for all applicants. So you can imagine, oh yeah, you could do that for engineers, like a coding test, right? Sure, but you could do it for all roles. I mean, we might be the only company in the world that hired a head of sales where there's applicants that do a job test. Because let me tell you, if you're, even decent at sales, surely you can be convincing in a conversation, but that says nothing about your ability to, strategically dissect a market, or be able to prioritize an opportunity to spend effort on, or quickly get to C-suite decision makers. But you can test all of this. You can construct a test with a little bit of effort, and at the end of it, there's a much higher likelihood that you'll end up with a person who can actually do the job, versus on paper they seem like they can, or they were great in the interview. And that's a lot of guesswork, and that's just not worth the risk.
Yeah, and I love that point that we can really focus on what the job requires and then ask everyone to demonstrate that. In addition to not being really predictive of performance, we know that often resumes and unstructured interviews are places where subtle biases based on, we're of the same race and we feel comfortable with each other, or class background, or all of those other things really creep in at that point. So kind of shifting to what's it going to look like for you, how are you going to approach the work is really key there. I see a couple questions about measuring employee engagement and psychological safety, and I know you have a real commitment to employees' well-being. How do you actually track that, and why do you spend the time and effort to do it?
So we don't have, there's no silver bullet around kind of measuring well-being. And so we try to do a bunch of different things. And importantly, we start from a place where we're assuming that someone who is not doing well is unlikely to share that concern, versus the opposite starting point, which is, oh, well, if someone's not doing well, they'll ask for what they need. No, that's not going to happen. And so we're constantly learning and constantly failing at, like, how do we essentially create multiple release valves for when something is going wrong, that somebody, and it's rarely going to be sort of a, going up sort of the management chain kind of thing, to create accountability and really kind of awareness, so that more than one person is likely to find out and be able to do something about it. But around measurement, so we have a company dashboard that the management team uses to run the business. It's about 40 KPIs. First, we try to be as transparent as we can, and that dashboard is published to the entire organization. So everybody in the company sees the same metrics as the management team does. When we meet as a leadership team, we publish notes of, here are the decisions we made, here are the topics discussed. Obviously, we don't share like confidential personnel things, but that's not most of what we talk about anyway. Right. So there's visibility. So having visibility contributes to feeling less insecure, because again, when you're remote, like, you don't know what's going on, right? And then if you're in the middle of an economic crisis, you really are going to have a lot of fear about what's happening in this company. And those fears are likely going to be much worse than the reality. And so transparency is important. But along to the question of how we measure it, so we have a couple of things we do. We have a bot that polls our team at 5 p.m. local time every day. And every day is a single poll. The poll is framed as a statement. And we cycle through about a dozen statements. And those statements are reflective of dimensions of well-being or inclusion that we as a group have decided are important to us. Because when we went out to the research literature to look for, like, how do you measure inclusion? It doesn't exist. So we defined it for ourselves, because as engineers, if we say we're going to be inclusive, well, first we got to define what is it, and then start tracking it and have a baseline, and then, do something about it. So, and those poll statements are tie back to things that we think are important, right? So I feel comfortable sharing my needs and challenges with my supervisor and team. That's a proxy for psychological safety, and, like, I'm going to ask for help if I need it. I feel equipped with the knowledge and tools to progress in my career. I'm set up for success. My unique strengths are valued by this company. I feel understood and valued by this company. I do not feel lonely at work. So we've been measuring loneliness. We coined the net loneliness score, which is named the FastCompany World Changing Idea after Net Promoter. But we believe, and net loneliness, our team's loneliness score is a KPI on par with our customer net promoter, because we think both of those are equally important forward-looking indicators of the health of the business. And so we've been tracking loneliness now for a few years. And even before COVID, actually we are less lonely after COVID, but fewer than 15% of Ultranauts report feeling lonely at work, compared to over 40% of the American workforce.
It's really fascinating, and it's I love your approach, the systems approach, this like, let's look at the context and not assume a person who is struggling is the issue, but what are we doing as a community and as a team and as a manager to build a context where this person can thrive. I think we are at the wrap-up stage. There are some terrific questions that we did not get to. Thank you all for the engagement in the chat. And Rajesh, thank you so much for being here. It was really inspiring and exciting. I loved learning more about it, and I'm sure the hackers did as well, and we'll be following Ultranauts closely. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thanks, Ilona, for having us.